So what I do? Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so I think we're ready. Maybe more people will join us shortly as they're coming from the recent panel discussion. But in the interest of time, hello everybody and welcome to this session. My name is Marcela Silva. I am the Regional Director for Infrastructure in the Latin America and Caribbean region at the World Bank. And for the next hour or so, also the moderator of this session. I want to start by giving you all a very warm welcome to this breakout session, and for me it's a pleasure to be guiding us through this conversation where we are going to be looking at the critical nexus between transport logistics and food supply. And where we are going to be addressing the very important question of how do we feed the world in the midst of a supply chain crisis. For the World Bank Group, food security is a very important topic, as it is very clearly, closely linked to our two twin goals of eradicating poverty and boosting shared prosperity. But I have to say that food security is still a significant challenge in many parts of the world, and millions of people suffer from hunger and malnutrition, and sadly, often because there is limited access to food that is available elsewhere. So this is where transport logistics play a very critical role to ensure that food that is available somewhere can reach areas where food supply is either naturally limited or where natural disasters or conflict or other type of disruptions are affecting food supplies. So one of the questions that I'm very much looking forward to answer from our expert panel and speakers is what innovative solutions are there out there to improve the effectiveness of transportation systems worldwide, not only to help move food from areas where there are surplus of food, but also to areas of deficit, but also to do so in a way that there is minimized food waste, that food gets and arrives safely and on a timely manner to where it's most needed, and that also transportation costs or overall costs are minimized. But as we will hear shortly from Martin, transport logistics are extremely vulnerable to shocks, and this is easily translated into high freight costs and disruptions in the supply chains. So this is what we have been recently experienced following the COVID-19 pandemic, following the war in Ukraine, as a result of which we have seen major disruptions in the global food supply chains, especially in terms of fertilizers and grains, which are essential inputs for the production of food. So in today's session, we will explore the links between transport logistics and food security and discuss how resilient and efficient transport infrastructure, technologies, policies can facilitate the development of sustainable food systems. We will also examine the challenges and barriers that people face on improving food-related transportation infrastructure in many parts of the world, but especially in developing countries, and consider ways that people are using to overcome those challenges. We are extremely lucky because we have a very esteemed panel of experts that bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise in areas of development, in areas of transport, in areas of agriculture. And that I hope that through this discussion we can explore what innovative measures are being taken to ensure food security for all. With that, now let me invite Dr. Martin Humphries, Martin to the podium. Martin is a lead transport economist and the global lead for, you see, transport, connectivity, and logistics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Logistics and connectivity.
Logistics and connectivity at the World Bank, and he's going to share with us a few initial thoughts to help us frame the discussion. And after that, we will invite the panel to join me in the podium. Over to you, Martin. You have 5 minutes.
5.5.
5 minutes to present a short, sharp, compelling pitch to get us going in the panel discussion. So over to you.
I interpret that as a Colombian 5 minutes, so it's really 6. Okay.
Very, very European 5 minutes.
Very European. No, I'm not European anymore. And we haven't started yet. I'll start from now. Thank you very much, Marcelo. Esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you, as Marcelo said, a very quick overview of the work that we've been doing in relation to food security through resilient and efficient connectivity. And let me start by pointing out what I think most of us know, and that is while shipping rates have eased from the highs seen during the pandemic, and indeed I saw something in the news this morning that Zim, one of the major shipping lines, was saying they think the rates have now finally bottomed out. The price of cereals, unfortunately, remains high and very sensitive to further disruption. Although they've come down a little bit in the last month, another 5% and 3% respectively in the figures on the right, there's still 101 export restrictions in place that cover about 11% of 2022 foodstuffs. In addition to that, export bans alone amount to nearly 4% of world trade. And of course, the recent disruption was not unique. We've gone back here to 2010, and we're only looking really at the large disruptions, and we have approximately one major disruption a year. And I'm not including things like Canada running out of oranges because Cape Town port shut because of weather, and Northern Europe running out of toilet paper because there was a ship caught in the Suez Canal. And providing resilient and efficient connectivity is essential to improve Africa's resilience to the next food crisis. Africa experiences a greater distance between food production, import, and consumption sites. This distance results in a high transport cost burden in food supply chains. At the local level, transport and logistical costs can amount to up to 50% of prices, which means that food costs can amount to 50 to 70% of household expenditures in the poorer countries. In addition, frictions in the supply chain can lead to shortages and high temporal and spatial price volatility in different places in Africa. And finally, and possibly very disturbingly, more than a third of food produced in Africa is lost, and that is a value that equates to the annual volume of cereal imports. One of the problems, of course, is that borders in many African countries and many LDCs, less developed countries, remain much thicker than everywhere else. Just as one example here, between Niger and Chad, there's a 479% increase in the value if you take a good across the border, 479 between Laos and Myanmar. And the solution needs to be holistic, involving trade policy, logistics services, non-tariff barriers, transport infrastructure, and integrated border management. The word is missing there. We've invested significant amounts of money on regional transport integration in Africa. And after a sharp decrease over the period 2016 to 2020, for reasons we won't go into here, the regional corridor program is now growing again, reaching 46% of our total transport lending to Africa in FY21, and if Dominic just moves his head, 31% in FY22, and that's up until the last fiscal year. Sorry, Dominic. Regional transport operations have, and this was an independent evaluation by the IEG group under the World Bank's auspices, have improved infrastructure and reduced time and cost for trade. And you can see the slide here. I'm not going to go into the details. Now, we also used logistical modeling to identify alternative routes for cereals trapped in Ukraine. We were given 3 months to come up with potential logistical routes, and the team that did that are sitting here in front of me. I'm not going to name them because I don't have time. And this was to find additional routes for the 23 million tons of grain that were trapped in Ukraine in the middle of last year when the war broke out. And, you know, we came up with a number of different scenarios that identified ways to get the grain out following a series of increasing interventions that got us up to a target of, I think, just under 3 million tons a month, which was the target that was set for us by the managing director. It's not enough, I hasten to add. And we're now using these same techniques for food and fertilizer supply chains in Africa. These models, and you can see an example on the right here of truck traffic, just truck traffic. 2019, the figure on the left, 2050, the figure on the right, are forecast. And they are intended to inform a new generation of trade and transport connectivity projects that focus on the supply chain or the value chain for specific commodities. And we are currently working on a project that focuses on manganese chrome containers and agricultural products between the Gauteng region and Maputo. And the design of these projects is informed by the suite of regional logistics and trade and transport freight models to systematically assess connectivity needs under a range of scenarios. The scenarios that we're looking at are decarbonization, resilience, explicit road-to-rail policies, a weight distance charge. And the idea is that we can re-envision solutions for green and efficient and resilient connectivity in our regional projects. Now, joining these regional models, and the one I'm illustrating here is obviously for the Southern African area, DRC, Tanzania down. We hope to get a model that covers the whole of Africa, and that's the starting point. And then we will extend that ideally in a short period of time, but I fear budgetary restrictions may mean it's a slightly longer period of time to cover the world. The idea is that we will have a global freight model bottom up. Now, ports are a key part of the logistical chain. Unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, no SSA port is in the top 100, let alone the top 200. I think there's one exception here in Beira and Tomasina here, you can see on the right, and it looks like Mombasa. All the others are in the 300s out of 370. And part of the problem is the lack of digitalization, which can bring significant benefits to improve both the performance of the port and the resilience of the port. And as of November 2020, only 49 out of the 174 member states of the IMO possess functioning port community systems. Out of the sub-Saharan African ports responding, and that was 11, the sample size, only 36% of those have a functioning port community system at that time. And we're undertaking a far more detailed survey now to get an up-to-date picture of whether they meet the new mandatory requirement of the FAL Convention to have a maritime single window, and whether they have a port community system, and whether there are any barriers in the institutional framework. And then, of course, improving logistics for food security also provides an opportunity to decarbonize freight transport. And this is moving from road to greener modes. And I mentioned the Maputo project, which would take 1,500 trucks a day off the road and put them onto rail. Greening freight services, enhancing the climate resilience of transport infrastructure and services. And then we are actively, within the global unit of the World Bank, Transport GP, participating in the dialogue at the IMO and elsewhere over the decarbonization of the maritime sector. And that team is actually here. And this, if a market-based measure is introduced, this will generate between 40 to 60 billion in carbon revenues annually, which could, of course, be repurposed to offset climate impacts in the LDCs and the SIDS. So in conclusion, I think I still have time. In conclusion, logistic costs can represent up to 50% of food prices, which means food costs can account for 50 to 70% of household expenditures in the poorest countries. And recent crises have shown that freight costs can increase tenfold in a short period of time, with major implications for food supply chains. Our regional logistics corridor projects combine hard infrastructure investments and soft trade facilitation policies, and have been effective at reducing logistics cost. But we feel now that to further enhance the impact of these projects, we're working on a new generation of regional projects that are informed by the modeling capabilities that I talked about, with greater attention to port performance, digitalization, and the climate footprint of the global food supply chains. And let me stop there, and I think I was well under the 5 minutes.
Very well. Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation, very short and concise. And again, not just to reiterate what we heard yesterday, we hear it back today, 50% of final food prices coming from logistics cost, and this can represent up to 70% of household expenditure, so it's a meaningful, impactful topic for poverty. And then also that we require holistic approaches to address these issues. Well, with that, let me invite our panel members to join me here in the stage. And as they take their seats, I will ask them to help us, to start reflecting. Please come and join me. Minister Almud, we have, of course, Jonathan connected, and Barbara, please join me on what we just heard. And maybe I will introduce each of our panel members, asking each of them one question that will allow them to tell us in more detail where are they coming from, and why does this subject is relevant for what they do. So let me start by introducing Ms. Fardousa Osman Eagle, Minister of Transport and Civil Aviation from Somalia. So Minister, welcome to the podium, welcome to the World Bank. Let's get the ball rolling with you. And we just heard that transport logistics are extremely vulnerable to shocks and the effects that this has on freight cost and supply chains. So from where you're sitting today as a Minister of Transport, what can you tell us about how the recent shocks to the global transport logistics, be it through the pandemic or be it through the war in Ukraine or increased tensions in the region, how all of these have affected food availability, food affordability in Somalia? And why does this matter to you as a Minister of Transport? Over to you, Minister. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on. Hi, good morning. I think it's still morning.
Yes.
That would be best. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fardousa, Minister of Transport and Civil Aviation from Somalia. And I just left the other plenary on the other room, and we were talking about resilience and how can we and I said we are not on the same level as everyone in the world. The shocks, the problems, the crisis, everything affect us more because my country, the past 35 years, we have crisis after crisis. We had civil war that last a long time, and then we have war with Al-Shabaab and terrorism group. We had political crisis. We had coronavirus. We had climate change that affect us. We had huge drought that left us famine, and so basically we are the bottom of everything. And so food security affects us because one, the recent war with Ukraine affect us a lot. We get most of our wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and so that has impact on us. Internally in Somalia, we have huge food insecurity, lack of harvesting or planting our own crop, lack of water, lack of access for security. So all in all, we are in bad shape when it comes to food security in Somalia. So we have all the problems in the world, I think. I don't know.
Minister, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and maybe tell us a little bit about what the government is doing, has done or is doing or will do in order to address some of these issues and to help make food supply chains more resilient in Somalia.
Thank you. Good question. First priority for the government is security. We have to liberate from Al-Shabaab. We have to take over our country back. So then at least we can think about how can we grow our own food? How can we reconstruct our roads? How can we? So now we are a new government, about 6-7 months, And so we are now on the stage where we are planning to fight with Al-Shabaab first, second, to rebuild the country, to rebuild our road, our transportation system. As you all might know, I'm sure Barbara and Alamud knows, Somalia, we have zero, some part of the country, land transport because of the connectivity and the access to road. So everything is by air. We sometimes take food delivered by air to different cities in Somalia. So you can tell how hard it is to do that. Very expensive. Sometimes we get donations from other countries by ports, and then we have to take by airplane to deliver those foods to different areas in Somalia. Very difficult, very challenging, very expensive. So hopefully we are moving more to land transport if we take over some parts of the world, the country from the Al-Shabaab.
Minister, thank you so much for sharing this, and this is perhaps a very good segue to for me to introduce Barbara. Barbara Van Lochem is a Senior Regional Logistic Officer at the World Food Program. Very warm welcome to you, and maybe picking up from when the minister just left. No, the World Food Program is one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations providing emergency food to relief to communities. So it would be great if, hearing what you just heard, what you could tell us a little bit about how the WFP organizes emergency food relief, particularly in cases like where you just heard that there is not enough transport infrastructure to move this. So how relevant and how important is transport logistics for what you do? So over to you and welcome.
Thank you very much. So maybe one additional point. We reach around 150 million of the most food insecure people across 123 countries, not only with emergency relief, but also with the rebuilding of livelihoods, increasing of resilience, and strengthening of local and regional food value chains. And I think that part of our work is a bit less well known. But the global hunger crisis is so enormous now, with around a projected 345 million food insecure people, which is more than a doubling of 2020, that we have to work on two fronts. We have to save lives of people whose lives are at risk, and work to strengthen the foundation of communities so that they can meet their own food needs. So now, in terms of how our logistics is organized when it comes to crisis response, a couple of key elements I would like to lift out. One very important aspect is preparedness. If you know the logistics capacity in a country, the access situation, the supply situation, the market situation, you can respond much faster when a crisis hits. So in the case of Somalia, for example, through our presence there and our working with authorities, we know where we have to reach by vessel, where we have to reach by air, where we can still go in country by road, and where we could possibly operate through others. Secondly, we have a facility called the Global Commodity Management Facility, GCMF, which allows us to position large quantities of food at the regional level closer to the people we serve, thus saving on lead time and risk. So when COVID hit, we had over 500,000 tons of food in the East Africa region, which covered our operations for around 5 to 6 months. When we had to replenish that food, we had to make some changes because of the disruption. So we had to substitute some commodities and also increase our local and regional procurement. And we have actually a policy that enables us to do that better now, which I can go into if there's time. Also during COVID, we set up one of the largest air operations globally when all the air transport collapsed. So we helped around 48 partners move 130,000 cubic meters of relief items to 160 countries. And we helped move the staff so that they could stay and do the job, and so be able to continue to deliver. And the reason why we could do that is we have logistics systems and processes that are geared toward flexibility and agility. We were able to leverage our global infrastructure and assets, and we have a very mobile supply chain workforce of around 5,000 people. The last point then is we are very good at the last mile logistics, so we use many different types of transport, from large vessels to barges and canoes, from railroad, our own trucks or commercial trucks, specialized vehicles to cut through swamps, and even packing animals at times. We open up waterways, rehabilitate rails, roads, bridges, etc. And in doing so, we also pave the way for commercial trade to increase to those areas. In all of this, we try to improve the sustainability of our supply chains. We've calculated the carbon footprint of all our supply chain operations in Eastern Africa, for example, and now we are determining strategies to reduce this. This will include things like reducing post-harvest losses, shortening supply chains, much smarter transport and storage solutions that are now coming up. And we would invite people who are interested in this, who have ideas and experience, to also approach us, because it is a priority for us. Thank you.
Excellent, Barbara. Thank you so much. So what I'm hearing, among many things, that definitely to address a food security crisis, you need to be able to adapt and have a lot of flexibility to find whatever it works to reach wherever you need to work. Thank you so much. Now let me turn to our screen and welcome Mr. Johan Swinnen, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, who is joining us virtually. Johan, a pleasure to have you here with us, and I know that you have just came from a very long trip, so we really appreciate you being here. The question for you, of course, is related to the research that the Institute has done over the past year in terms of the impacts of the war in Ukraine on global agriculture markets and food security. So it would be great if you could share with us some of the key findings of this research in terms of global food prices and the role that transport costs usually play in the affordability or non-affordability of food in specific parts of the world. Over to you, and warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Very good.
All right. I'm saying it's great to be with you, but it would have been greater if I would actually be with you physically as well. But thanks very much for inviting me for this session. I went through, Martin only had 5 minutes to present all this material. I went through the slide before. I think it's fascinating material, hugely relevant, I think, for what we are dealing with day to day, and of course where the poor people are dealing with. We have seen, Martin already showed some of the points, and I think in the introduction that we mentioned as well. So there's been massive changes in global food prices and markets over the past year, particularly due to the Ukraine war. And so we've seen a massive increase in prices in the spring, and then we've seen a very significant fall in prices again in the fall, basically September, October, and later again. So one of the reasons why there's been this big fluctuation is because prices were already very high from an historical perspective before the invasion of Ukraine, and stocks were relatively low. And so the combination of that, and of course the impact directly on the Russian and the Ukraine market and their participation in trade, really had a very strong effect. Right now, I mean, we've seen very significant reduction. Prices remain high from an historical perspective, so there is no reason to be too optimistic there. And the same thing actually applies to fertilizer markets, where we've seen similar price evolutions, price fluctuation, but also there, although prices have come down, they continue to be historically high. The reason why prices have come down a bit in the last 6 months really there has been significant shifts in trade patterns, and so a number of other countries have picked up some of the slack, the gaps which were there, particularly in Canada, for example, some of the Latin American food exporters, but also Russia has exported much more this year than it exported last year, and that holds both for food and for fertilizer. We've seen some reduction in demand in China, which because of the COVID constraints there. And then, of course, the Baltic Sea agreements, which allowed Ukraine to export some of its grain, and it has also exported some of it through Europe and Turkey. But this has been a very costly export, and what you see is that the farm gate prices, the prices that Ukrainian farmers are getting, is significantly lower because of these increased trade costs. And that has resulted in the fact there's significantly lower production plantings in Ukraine now for three planting seasons in a row. And this, of course, has an impact. I think some of the trade constraints have also come from export constraints that other countries have introduced. This is now a recurring phenomenon. In 2007, 2008, where we have these big price shocks, we saw that several countries introduced export constraints, which continued for almost a year. Then with COVID in 2020, we saw the same phenomenon. I think that time we were better prepared. The World Bank, FAO, IFPRI as well, OECD immediately stepped up, said, please, countries, governments, do not do this, you make things worse. And so it had an impact, okay? After a couple of weeks, months, some of these export constraints had been removed. Now we're having a kind of a mixed situation that we've seen the same reaction again, export constraints, and some of the countries have removed them, but there's still a significant amount which is there. Maybe just a few more broader points here is that one is that we've seen the Ukraine crisis has really come on top of several crises which were already there, if you want. We've seen a structural change in malnutrition, that malnutrition hunger is picking up again after almost 25 years of progress. For structural reasons, then we've seen climate, weather shocks, very important, conflicts on the rise in the world, and COVID, of course. And these, of course, accumulate in terms of the capacity of households to deal with them, and also the capacities of governments to deal with them in terms of depletion of fiscal resources, etc. Looking back, when we talk about shocks, okay, that's in the market, shocks means deviation from normal. But when you look over the last 20 years in terms of food price fluctuation, I mean, the new normal is volatility. So that also means from a resilience perspective, what we do as policymakers, international organizations, this should be central in our thinking. And trade and transport is really important, I think, from there. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to come in with a couple of other points later in the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we will definitely come back to you in a bit. Maybe now let me turn to Almut Weiss, Transport Practice Manager for Eastern Africa and the World Bank. Almut, you have been a transport manager first in East Asian Pacific and now in Eastern Africa. And these two regions are regions where food security cannot be taken for granted. So why don't you give us a little bit of an example of the type of transport operations that the World Bank is supporting in these regions, and what are we doing to improving supply chains food supply chains in these two regions? You heard the minister. So what are the type of things that we are doing, and we take it from there.
Thanks, Marcela, and definitely, fascinating session. I know what Martin presented, we've been working on for quite some time now together, and sort of combining the various pieces of analytics that we've done. And I think the work that was done on Ukraine is actually exemplary of how we want to translate that into sort of a Africa-wide and maybe then a global model, because I get a sense from the two regions. I worked for a very long time in East Asia and the Pacific. And while maybe in East Asia, food crisis is not as acute, the Pacific definitely is, as we all know, highly, highly, highly dependent on stuff coming in and out, especially the atoll islands that basically produce almost nothing themselves. If they are not connected, for them it's a lifeline. And so COVID just amplified, and during COVID, you probably know that all the Pacific islands just basically closed borders. Some of us know how quickly they closed, because they traveled there and couldn't get in. And and for them, it really became then a very dire situation of how do we feed our people while that is happening. And for years, right? This was not something that was done very shortly. So I think there we really worked very closely on our transport projects together with our colleagues in agriculture to see what can be done in the meantime until the countries are comfortable again to kind of bring food and bring people and food into the country. So that was quite special, actually, I think, for the Pacific Islands. And so for them, resilience, being connected was the big theme. Maybe bringing it then to the East Africa region where I work now, where we definitely work in countries as Somalia, with a lot of shocks, and then DRC, probably know that DRC Congo is one of the least connected countries in the world, has the least number of roads, and basically people live in total isolation, complete isolation. So for them, improving that and getting somewhere onto a road and supply chain is again a lifeline issue. And then we have countries in that region like Kenya and Tanzania who could definitely use every opportunity as a crisis, every crisis as an opportunity, other way around, and could do much more of agriculture production and actually feed the region if the borders weren't that thick. Or even within countries, you find situations such in South Sudan where you have an area that produces a lot, can't get it out, food is rotting, and then you have another part of South Sudan where everybody is malnourished because nothing is reaching them. So I don't know how many of you were yesterday in the session where the Prime Minister of Cote d'Ivoire talked, but I think he was absolutely to the point where he was saying, I need the whole supply chain looked at. Don't give me just a transport project. Don't give me just hard infrastructure and a few soft measures, which, by the way, I'm trying to eliminate this hard and soft discussion because to me the soft part is as vital, and it is unfortunately with some governments that they will take out the red pen and start crossing out anything that sounds soft. So I would like to find a different language to really make everybody understand that we need to really look from farm to market, or as we did in Mongolia, from hoof to plate, basically really looking at what are the bottlenecks along the way, from production, warehouses, cold chain, road infrastructure for sure, then trade capacities, etc. in the countries. And so we're kind of, what Martin alluded to, I think sort of the generation of regional corridor infrastructure projects that we're trying to do now more and more. So we'll really be looking at particular goods and whether it's cereals or whether it's meat or something, and really kind of try to follow from the beginning to end what needs to change, and put that all together in projects that we can support governments with. And I think that's what we're working on right now. Thank you.
Excellent, Almut. Thank you so much. And I think that resonates a lot with what we heard from Martin. I know that we are running a little bit late because we started late, so I'm going to go through a second round of questions, and some of them addressed to most of you. But I think that we need to go very quickly. It has to be like a roundup of, okay, what do you think, and move on, like less than a minute, so that we can leave space for the audience to ask questions as needed. So maybe let me start with a question based on, to the Minister Eagle, based on your experience, or what kind of transport and trade policies do foster food security, and what kind of policies tend to pose a threat to food security? So what do you think are the 2 or 3 key policies that we should be supporting as we go forward?
Thank you. I think that us in Somalia, we are trying to, like Almut said, we're trying to go from zero to go up. So we really want to focus on first how to rebuild and get back our system that's been destroyed for over 35 years. That's one. And the second thing is, how can we grow our own food locally and then get the connectivity that we can transport? So overall, I think we need to focus on policy that focus more on local food security.
Perfect. Excellent. Almut, what do you think?
What do I think
about the same question, no? What are the key policies that we are supporting beyond? You already touched a little bit on that, on the, let's go through the whole value chain. Anything else, any other policy that you think that is more disruptive than supportive of food security?
No, I would just add the resilience, the climate resilience angle to it. And I think we need to do a lot more sort of vulnerability and criticality assessments in Africa, where you have very little plan B routes. So in Europe, if a corridor doesn't work, you have options. In many of our countries that we work in, there are no options. If a key corridor is interrupted, you have an enormous deviation, sometimes even going to other countries. And so looking at the criticality of that and how often they get hit and how that needs to be built in, and then maybe focus on those in the first, in the first next round of new corridor investment, I think that's critical.
Perfect. So building redundancies to the system. Johan, over to you. From the research that you have done, what are the key policies that need to be supported, or what are the ones that are more a deterrent for food security? Very quickly.
I probably need an hour for that, but
can you take 1 minute max?
Okay, 1 minute. Let me point the following. This links up to what several people have been commenting. So we've done quite a lot of work in the past decade, really, on trade in Africa. Okay, and there we see that there's a lot of the trade is not formal, but it's informal. Okay, and often also by small and medium enterprises, etc. And there's tremendous, basically, trade cost or getting. And I mean, I heard it was actually getting trade. Produce from one part of the country to the other, but even certainly across borders. There's lots of regulatory barriers, there are non-trade barriers, there's all kinds of things, and that really has a big impact on the capacity to trade internally. And then the whole end of the whole very different value chain is, for example, the very high value or value product which is shipped, for example, from East Africa to Europe or from Latin America to the US in terms of flowers or vegetables, etc. I mean, that is also a very important factor. So we have very different types of value chains there. And so each of them deserves attention, but for different aspects, if you will.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I had another question here that Minister already sort of touched upon. The question is, what do you think is more effective, developing your own food locally or improving the supply chain, no? So I think that I heard your answer very loud and clear. Barbara, what do you think? What is a more efficient way of strengthening food supplies?
Yeah, great question. I think we need to work on both because there will be disruptions in both in import supply chains and in local and regional supply chains. And if we just focus on one, we may still have problems if there are disruptions in that area. Having said that, the focus of World Food Programme at the moment is on excuse me, strengthening local and regional food value chains. We are certainly not starting from scratch with that, because of the 4.4 million tons of food that we move every year, about half is procured locally and regionally. What we now have is a new policy, a local and regional food procurement policy that allows us to work much more closely with smallholder farmers and build their logistics capacity and production and link them better with markets. To reduce their losses, costs, and increase their income. So that policy allows us to do that much more. At the same time, as was mentioned, there are a lot of barriers to trade that also affect our humanitarian logistics. So we work with regional and local entities to help address those.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Partnerships, excellent. The last question on this round, because I think it's very important to touch a little bit about the role of technologies and digital technologies. So what do you, and this will go for all the panelists, no? So to what extent do you think that new digital technologies are an enabler and of making food supply chains more resilient and lowering the associated transport costs? So do you have any example that you can give us? And maybe let me this time start with Almut, just to give a fair chance to the other panelists and Minister to think a little bit before I go to you. Almut, any examples?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, on sort sort of an analytical level, definitely. And so I remember we did some work in Vietnam at some point on trucking, and we're looking into, you know, who owns the trucks, who transports things, and it's all in a country as efficient as Vietnam. It turns out to be these are all mom and pop, one truck, two truck companies that go one way completely full and come back empty. And so for a country like that, and a country as dynamic as Vietnam with 8% growth and whatever, to set up a digital platform where they could exchange a bit. I'm going to region so-and-so, do you have anything for me to transport back? You know, almost like an Uber type kind of service, bring more people together. That would be a very easy setup, more difficult maybe in other countries, but it would make a lot of sense to do that. And I think we were, and here comes the why it stayed on the analytical level. We haven't had a project in Vietnam to build that in, but that was the idea, to kind of build that into a project that looks more at how can Vietnam get more efficient in trucking.
Excellent, very good example. Johan, from your side, 20 seconds, what do you think? Any example on digital technologies?
Absolutely. You know, we did a lot of work on how COVID has affected value chains. And the lesson there is that value chains have actually been much more resilient than we anticipated initially. And one of that was the very strong and very rapid introduction of digital technology, including e-commerce, even in low-income countries, and certainly in low and middle-income countries. And so that has had we talked to management that we introduced now in 6 months what we had planned in 10 years or something. Mm-hmm. And so I think being major shock in innovation, but at the same time also has increased the resilience a lot, I think. Thanks.
Excellent. Barbara, over to you.
Yeah, I would echo both actually, because we are also looking at these transport platforms that are popping up here and there in different countries that will help address the empty backhaul. So for our own transport, but also it will increase the reach, the availability of transport for smallholder farmers. And then COVID related as well, and Somalia related, we also developed an application that allowed for decentralized food distribution. So basically home delivery, because Somalia has a relatively high penetration of mobile phones. So that was one other innovation that is still relevant in many countries and growing. There are also non-digital related innovations, again with an eye on sustainability and emissions, that are coming up, such as airships, believe it or not, that are a few years down the line, that are very exciting to us. Thank you.
Excellent. Minister, over to you. Sorry. Last word for you.
I agree what everyone said. I think digitalized or, it will make booking, tracking, everything easy in transportation, I think. So it's...
Okay, so I think we have a couple more minutes. I have not seen my sign telling me that I'm out of time, so I'm going to take, if anybody has any questions from the audience for this panel, please, this is your time. I'm also checking if there are any questions from the people connected, I'm sorry. Digital, yeah, people connected. So anybody who wants to ask a question here, please, there is the mic, and then I'm going to ask, maybe you can give us a little bit of the questions that are coming from our live audience. So please introduce yourself and give us your question.
Yes, my name is Jaman Kubba. I'm at the International Transport Workers Federation, and thank you. This is a very important issue. I just wanted to ask a question. As we all know, transport systems depend on workers. And when you have an emergency, for example, just now we've had Turkey and Syria, we immediately have seen transport workers jumping in because they're the ones who have to deliver everything. They're also the ones who often are affected. So during COVID, you found we had 100,000 seafarers left stranded because borders were closing. So my question is, how are you building that into the planning that you're talking about? How do you see that being part of the system as we move forward? Thank you.
Excellent. Who would like to take that question? Admul?
I can take just a part of it, because I think this is actually really key when we're talking about holistic approaches. So I was recently at the border between Malawi and Mozambique, where we're building sort of one-stop border posts. And a very simple question: what are you going to do about the truckers? Are they, when they sit here for hours, is there even a toilet for them? And so they were scratching their head and said, yeah, I think we should build one. And I said, no, you should that should be part and parcel all the time, and more than that, of course, restaurants and this. So I think the fact that COVID has brought out some of this that wasn't visible before. I felt it was really sort of an invisible community of workers, like bees, who brought everything back and forth. And then everything came to a halt and the voices became louder. Unfortunately, now it's becoming quieter again and they're overlooked again. So I think it is our duty collectively to make sure that when we talk about holistic policies, we definitely make sure that what is being built and in terms of cross-border posts is very clearly catering to them and gives them some relief before they go into the next country. Over.
Excellent. I don't know if that's our cue. I don't know what that is. Somebody's phone. Anybody else who would like to come? That's your phone. Yes, please. Almut, thank you so much for that insightful question. Maybe we go to the questions from the audience in Connected.
Absolutely. So there's been quite a lot of interest, particularly for Her Excellency, the Minister from Somalia. And the audience is wondering whether or not you even have the capacity to think about the green transition and rebuilding your infrastructure in that kind of a way if your essential infrastructure is not functioning properly yet. And also what the role of the neighboring countries and their transportation network is in helping your country and food security.
Yes, definitely. I mean, if we are rebuilding, why not? Obviously, we want to rebuild better and greener, so we are going on that path.
Excellent. And I think that that's something also that we do through our policies and the things that we do in the bank. No, Almut, when we are building back better, this is exactly what we're doing. But I understand that the question is, of course, you have so many priorities. How do you build into all of these the green part also on top of everything? Munisa, please.
Munisa Alam from the World Bank. So just one question from me, building on what Marcela was asking in terms of what are the policies that we can implement. So I was thinking through this issue of like food security, and I feel like we always focus a little bit in the aftermath of a disaster, so to speak. But prices, if you think of like the price that I as a consumer get, at the end of the day, that's the final price that I'm facing, and that's how I'm feeding my family. Prices tend to be sticky when they come down. So I was wondering if in Somalia, or if the work done by IFPRI or if the World Bank has been thinking about that issue. Like once prices increase, they take some time to come down, and that has an impact on children, on their human capital, wasting, stunting, so on and so forth.
Excellent. Who would like to take that question? Munisa, I think that you gave us some trouble here. Barbara, do you want to give it a first try?
I can comment if you want.
First. Okay, I'll have a go. Sorry, Ahmed, I apologize. Munisa, as always, excellent question. I mean, two parts to it. One is, I rather resent the suggestion that we only respond to the crisis, because I would have hoped that within the bank, and certainly in my experience, we've done work over the last 15 years on regional projects where we're very conscious of the difference in prices of food staples. And indeed, I think WFP and IFPRI actually monitor the price of food staples in different markets. Going back to the problems after the Kenyan election of 2008, when the Northern Corridor was closed. And we have been trying to put in infrastructure, Lake Tanganyika being an excellent example, where food staples on the DRC side, which is what Almut said, are 5 or 6 times what they are on the Tanzanian side. But the only transport across, unless it's a small fishing boat, is a 112-year-old vessel provided by the Germans in 1898, which we looked at the feasibility of improving now, but unfortunately that project didn't go forward. On the second part, yes, I think you can see from the graph that I put up, and I'm sure Joe and Barbara would agree with this, the prices are sticky, and that's partly due to the regulations and the restrictions and the uncertainty. The UN Grain Agreement is lauded as a success. I'm assuming this is Chatham House rules, and it's got, I think, 24 million tons out in 7.5 months, which is about 3.2 million tons a month. That's not enough. We're looking at 5 million tons a month, 60 million tons. And so there's still a gap there, and there's still a considerable amount of uncertainty there. And then you have the 101 export ban and export restrictions that I think Joe talked about that have yet to be removed. You also have the new ones that are introduced on a sort of petty ad hoc basis, like the one between Tanzania and Kenya. You know, in theory, they should easily be able to trade certain foodstuffs like maize, but they don't. Partly out of pettiness, to be honest. And then you have, you know, the bans, which I think amount for, what, 3.8% of total food supply. You know, they need to be removed as well. So if you had a completely free market with no export restrictions and no bans, then it probably wouldn't be as sticky. But are we doing research? That's a question I probably need to pose to my agricultural colleagues who aren't here today, as you know.
Barbara, over to you.
Yeah, maybe just to add that as part of the work we do with markets is we find out what the key bottlenecks are, and we try to work with both on the farmer side and on the retail and wholesale side. We try to work to address those bottlenecks, dealing also with policymakers. Thank you.
Excellent. So I have 3 more minutes.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, please, Johan, please come in.
Yeah, very quickly. So in the US, for example, for every dollar that goes to that the consumer pays in the market, 5 cents go to the farmer. So 5%. Okay, that's the basic commodity price. Even now in lower middle income countries, where this includes all the the big countries, right? We estimate now at 30%. So that means that 70%, even there, is not the grain prices which you see moving on that the farmer gets. So that explains part of the stickiness as well. And so we just have new research coming out, which is actually very discouraging. It shows that the 5% increase in real food prices at the consumer level leads to a 14% increase in wasting. And this is based on a very large data set in developing countries. So very concerning, actually. I think the numbers are much bigger than we had anticipated. Thanks.
Wow, that's a very sad picture. Any other burning questions from our live audience, from our present audience? If not, I am going to start closing this session by really thanking everybody, and particularly our esteemed panelists and all of you for joining us in this conversation. I really hope that we have all gained a better understanding of what needs to be done in order to improve food security for all, so that transport sector is a real contributor to make food security a reality. We discussed some of the challenges and possible solutions. We heard from the minister. Minister, we are with you. I'm sure that Almud and the team are working and helping you, Adam, in addressing all the infrastructure needs and to addressing food security. And with that, just to let you know that, remind you that there is a short lunch break now, and that you will be resuming the next session at 1:30 p.m., whatever session you would like to do with that. Thank you so much, and thank you also to our organizers of this panel. Dominic, thank you very much, and to all the colleagues in the second row for this fantastic session.